Welcome to the chapel of Robinson College here at the University of Cambridge. It's 2020, it's locked down and it's empty. So this term we're conducting a series of interviews with key thinkers from around the world, and our theme is the fall of Jerusalem's great temple. The temple, after all, had been the meeting place of heaven and earth, where humanity encountered transcendence. But for many thinkers today, it's now technology that fulfills that purpose, because it's via technology that human beings might just have access to some form of post-human, post-mortal future. A human being, after all, is an assembly of subatomic particles which, for a tragically minuscule nanofragment of time, have taken the form of carnal matter. But what if technology offered some means of access to a post-human, post-mortal future that far outlasts both the species and the planet? Today we're very pleased to welcome Lord Martin Rees, who, in his latest book on the future, lays out some of the potentialities and the pitfalls awaiting humanity in the next century and beyond. Martin Rees is the Astronomer Royal, a Fellow and former Master of Trinity College, and an Honorary Fellow here at Robinson. We begin our interview with a brief reading from Hebrew Scripture that highlights the abysmal cosmic insignificance of the human race.
O Adonai, our sovereign, how majestic is your name! You have set your splendor above the skies. When I consider your heavens, the work of your hands, the moon, the stars which you have set in place, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? What are mortals that you care for them? You made them a little lower than divinities and crowned them with glory and honor. O Adonai, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth.
Professor Martin Rees, very warm welcome to this version of Robinson College Chapel, slightly different to usual. We've been exploring your book on the future, which came out a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could begin by laying out something of why you felt compelled to write that book.
Well, I think I'm an astronomer, so I think in terms of long time scales. The Earth's been around for 45 million centuries, but this is the first one where one species, the human species, has the power to determine the planet's fate. And that's really because there are more of us, we're more demanding of energy resources, and we're more empowered by technology. So I really tried to address all those issues in a book, being a bit gloomy in some respects, but offering some hope as well, I hope.
It's an interesting combination of optimism and pessimism, I suppose. Just to put the book on the map of where some other books are on the future, we have people like Steven Pinker, Hans Rosling, who've got a very optimistic view, but whose critics say that they sweep some of the data under the carpet. The other extreme, you've got Chris Hedges, Slavoj Žižek, who despair and say the only hope for humanity is total revolution. And you don't tend to tread a midway between the two, but you embrace both and say that you're both a technological optimist and a political pessimist.
Yes, well, to expand on that a bit, I think the figures and the graphs which we have in Hans Rosling's book and Steven Pinker's book, they're correct about growing life expectancy, falling infant mortality and all that. That's all good news. And those are grounds for optimism. But I think what they leave out of account, in particular Steven Pinker, is that there are new threats which are emergent because we are affecting the entire planet, we are globally interconnected, and we are empowered technologically, so even a few people can cause damage that cascades globally. And of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic, which exemplifies this. Nothing could have spread globally at this same speed had it not been for modern technology. And so I think we're in a world where we are going to have to confront a new class of global threats, and which these are what we're thinking about in our new centre in Cambridge, because they are understudied compared to conventional threats. So set against the obvious positive trends emphasised by Rosling and Pinker, there are these new emergent threats. And my mantra is that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. These are new, but even one occurrence is too many. And we're seeing this already with pandemics, and we may confront other threats. And I am not an ethical optimist, because although it's probably right to say that the world's population on average is better off and happier than in any previous century, the gap between the way the world is and the way it could be is wider. What I mean by that is, if you go back to the Middle Ages, things were pretty grim in the 14th century, but there wasn't much they could do about it. Whereas now there's a huge gap between the way the world is, with 1 billion people in abject poverty and 2,000 people with enough money to double the income of those billion people. And it's an ethical indictment that we allow these huge inequalities to exist and other things. So I don't think we can claim any real ethical progress over previous centuries.
That's interesting. Do you think we may be at I think you used the phrase an evolutionary bottleneck, in terms of where technology's brought us, we've got the capacity either to hoover ourselves up out of existence or to spawn some form of artificial intelligence that might make us the progenitors of something magnificent.
Well, I mean, I'll say a word in a moment about the post-human future, but I think we don't need to have a drastic change like that. I think it's perfectly possible to have a global society where we can minimise these risks and have a fairer share and reduce inequalities within each country, and even more important, between different parts of the world. I mean, I make a big deal in my book about the problems if Africa gets left behind, when they know what they're missing because they have internet, but they don't have any other resources. So we've got to level up between continents as well as within nations. But I do think that we are going to have to address a new set of ethical issues which arise from new technologies, particular genetic modification and all that, and also cyborg technique where we can add extra memory to by plugging in to some computer. All these things are going to come. I think my line on those is that we have to be very careful. We have to try and regulate them, because if they were allowed, then they would lead to a new fundamental kind of inequality, because only a few people will be able to afford them. So I think that there are going to be concerns about that. I think what we want to do is to preserve the Earth the way it could be, not too much change. But since you raised that, let me look towards the more distant future, because I'm an astronomer and I realise that although the Earth's been around for 45 million centuries, it's got another 60 million centuries more in the future before the sun flares up and dies. So to an astronomer, it's not conceivable to think of humans as a culmination of evolution, but maybe not even a halfway stage. And so future evolution, if we don't wipe ourselves out, will take place here on Earth and maybe far beyond. And this will be, I would say, perhaps a sort of secular intelligent design. And it won't be Darwinian selection. It will be designing humans to adapt to alien environments, and perhaps maybe become electronic entities. This will happen. But my hope is that this doesn't happen here on Earth. But I think if a few crazy pioneers go to Mars by the end of the century, they'll be the prototype post-humans, because they'll be in an alien hostile environment. They'll be away from the regulators, and they will perhaps be the first to become rather different from humans themselves. And of course, within a few centuries, they may have become electronic, and then they won't need an atmosphere. They may prefer zero gravity. and if they're near immortal, they can go off into the blue yonder. So that's a scenario for the far future. But I think here on Earth, we're going to want to try and regulate all these things. But again, the regulation issue I address in my book in a different context, because one of my nightmares is that we will have pandemics which are even worse than those we now have, because they could be genetically modified. And it's been possible for nearly a decade to modify the influenza virus to make it more virulent or more transmissible. It's possible to synthesize the smallpox virus. The coronavirus is more complicated, but one can imagine that within a decade or so, it'll be possible to engineer an even more dangerous virus with perhaps the seriousness of Ebola, but the transmissibility of flu. And what really scares me is that one occurrence of that will be too many. And unlike building a nuclear bomb, which requires large special purpose facilities, this will only involve the kind of facilities which may exist in many laboratories, etc. And how do we stop this happening? Clearly, it's only going to be some fanatic, but of course there are some fanatics who think that the world is being polluted by too many human beings, so they wouldn't mind if they killed off a few. And some of them will be empowered by technology. And I think, given the empowerment of individuals to cause massive disruption by bio or also by cyber attacks, then all nations are going to face a starker decision as to how they balance three things we want: security, liberty, and privacy.
Right. And I suppose there are all kinds of questions that raises: the extent to which the nation state for the next 100 years will have the authority to do that.
Yes.
Equally, again, from an ethical perspective, I suppose, wouldn't it just be best then, given humanity's potential for self-destruction, if we hurried towards relinquishing control of the world to artificial intelligence that's not subject to ambition, selfism, and so on? I mean, it used to be the stuff of nightmares in science fiction films. Robots will be our masters. But just fans of Star Trek, for instance, they'd be quite happy with Commander Data being in charge of the world. Would there be something benevolent, do you think, about this gradual takeover of artificial intelligence?
Well, I think it's rather scary, because although AI can do wonderful things already in managing huge computer networks, from electricity grids and traffic flows, and indeed if the Chinese wanted to have a completely planned economy of a kind that Marx or Stalin could only dream of, they could now have it. So it allows tremendous things. But of course, what these computers don't have is common sense. Nor do they really interact with the real world like we do. And so I don't think we're ever going to be happy to be in that scenario. I mean, already there are issues about whether our lives should be affected by a decision made by AI, whether we're denied credit, recommended for surgery, or sent to prison. We feel that this ought to be done by a human being with reasons that we can contest. And even if we're told that on the whole the AI makes better judgments than the average human being, still we feel that we ought to be able to contest this. And so I think we've got to be very cautious about handing over any decisions about individuals, let alone communities, to any artificial intelligence.
And presumably, though, artificial intelligence will evolve itself to the point where it has a complex capacity for identification with the other, for what we might call emotion. Is that completely off the scale?
Well, let me say, I'm not an expert on this, so I don't know. But of course, if it evolves by itself, then there's no reason to think it will evolve in a benign way. We've no idea what it would do, and we do have to be careful. But I think I agree with you to one extent in that if we envisage a far future evolution of species which are post-human, then, as I say, it won't be a Darwinian selection. It'll be a much faster process of secular intelligent design. But of course, whereas Darwinian selection favoured intelligence but also aggression, it's certainly possible that the future intelligence would not favour aggression. And this, incidentally, is relevant to another thing that I'm interested in. Is there life out there already? And people look for it. But if there is life out there already, then people tend to feel it'll be aggressive and will come and eat us, so we've got to be careful. But it's more likely to be some sort of electronic life, which may be thinking deep thoughts and very contemplative and not expansionist at all. And so we've got to imagine that that's a possible future.
I was going to ask you about that. One of the things that you mentioned is that if we end up developing intergalactic space travel, it's unlikely to be organic life that does that, because there isn't time.
Yes.
It's more likely that it's some form of machine future. And that's most likely to be, if there is alien life out there, what we would encounter.
Yes, yes.
Which makes it less likely that it would be predatory.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
Can I ask you, since the series of interviews this term is largely based on the fall of the temple, the theme of the temple, and the temple, the sociological function in the Mediterranean world and in Judaism, is the site where you encounter something radically other. You trespass into something that transcends beyond time and space. And there are some writers on technology who are saying that technology now fulfills that purpose. It's the interface between what's here and the world of possibility that lies beyond us.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Do you see technology as an exclusively positive means of progress?
Absolutely not. I mean, the way it's channeled depends on human decisions, and it can lead to us wiping ourselves out by intention or by accident, and it can, of course, lead to a more benign world if we redirect our technology. So it can go either way. So I don't think it's in any sense going to have these universally benign effects. But I think to answer your question slightly differently, I think what is a feature of the present world is rapid change. And I think one of the virtues of organised religion, in my view, is that it does indicate our affinity with previous generations and our responsibility towards future generations. And I'd like to make 2 points in this connection. One is that when you go to, say, Ely Cathedral, which is this wonderful building put up by people who, on the whole, would not see it finished, and whose horizons were very limited. They didn't know anything beyond Europe. They thought the world might last only 1,000 years. But they built this cathedral, which inspires us 800 or 900 years later. Whereas now, we don't have this cathedral thinking, as it were. Now, at first sight, this seems paradoxical, but the reason it's less paradoxical is that although our middle-aged forebears had limited horizons in space and time, they thought change was slow. So they thought their children and grandchildren would be like them, and they would appreciate the finished cathedral, even if they didn't. Whereas now, we don't know much about the wishes and attitudes of our children and grandchildren. And looking further ahead to the ideas you mentioned about changing ourselves by cyborg techniques and all that, then this is a real game changer, because one feature of our culture and our religions is that we have an affinity with the authors and artists 2,000 or 3,000 years ago who produced classical literature, the scriptures and all that, because human nature has not changed. Whereas I think we can have no confidence whatever that whatever intelligent entities dominate 500 years from now will have anything beyond a sort of algorithmic understanding of what we humans are like. So it'll be a real game changer if human nature, which is the one thing which has been pretty constant throughout our recorded civilization and religions and our literature, is something which doesn't survive unchanged.
You mentioning the word game changer reminds me, I'd read the game theorist, is it John Horton Conway?
Yes, yes.
In fact, I read, sadly, he died a couple of months ago.
He did, yes. Mm-hmm.
But I suppose the author of game theory, as we understand it today,
Yes.
he'd spoken about how complexity can develop from simplicity.
Yes.
And I think in a moment of wild speculation, you'd said it's possible that the universe as we know it, we may just be part of a game.
Yes.
Of somebody else's game. Of course, it's wild speculation,
Yes.
but of course, from a Christian perspective, that sounds remarkably compatible with some views of what creation is. Could you say a little more about that?
Well, I mean, I think the extreme idea which John Conway was talking about was the idea we're in some sort of simulation, and there's some sort of superintelligence which can make a simulation as complicated as our world, not just kind of simulations which I make to try and understand galaxies in my computer, and that's not absurd, but it's pretty unlikely, I think, really. But and then people who believe that, they're going to say, well, if that's the case, then we've got to live interesting lives, because if our creator gets bored, he'll just pull the plug at the end of it. So I don't take that too seriously. But more seriously, there is the point that we do believe that everything in our universe and here on Earth evolved from a simple beginning, which we can date to about 13.8 billion years ago, and we can now chart the various stages whereby atoms formed, and then complex chemistry and stars and galaxies, etc. And so the idea of emergent complexity, which is in a sense the kind of thing which Conway's so-called Game of Life showed, even from simple rules, you can get this, and of course the simple rules of physics are those which in a sense determine all that happens, although when things get very complicated, you get complicated chemistry, you then get biological organisms. In a sense, they're all consequences of simple physics. But to understand them, we need to have new concepts. I mean, the way I like to think of it is that sciences are in a sort of hierarchy. There's particle physics at the bottom, then there's the rest of physics, then there's chemistry, then there's biochemistry and cell biology, then organisms, all the way up, and then social sciences and the economists in the penthouse, or sort of thing. So this happens. But although in a sense we are all reductionists in that we don't believe in vitalism as something really new that comes in for life, that doesn't mean that the way to explain anything complicated is in terms of Schrödinger's equation of atomic physics. Every science has its own fundamental quantities. I mean, you know, if you're a psychologist, you have your consequences. If you're animal behavior, you have ideas like imprinting, etc. But to give a simple example, let's take fluid mechanics, you know, where you talk about flows and when waves break and water goes turbulent and all that. This is a, as you know, well-defined part of applied mathematics, okay, and it has its concepts. But the people who do that, they don't care that water's H2O. They note in principle, if you could solve Schrödinger's equation for 10 to the power 30 atoms, you would be able to calculate how a wave breaks. But it doesn't give you any insight.
Right.
The flow of a liquid, which no one thinks is deeply mysterious, it depends on quite different concepts. We get our understanding by using concepts on the appropriate level, and by extension, that's true of trying to understand living organisms and trying to understand human beings. We may not want to deny that we are solutions to Schrödinger's equations, but that's not the way to explain what we do.
Of course. Yeah, can I move you then to a final question about technology and how we progress, scientific progress and so on? There are lots of research and development centres specifically looking for specific breakthroughs in specific areas. To what extent is our technological advance dependent upon specifically looking, and to what extent is it dependent on sheer accident?
Well, I mean, I think, as Pasteur said, fortune favours a prepared mind. So you've got to have the preparation and understand the basic technology before you stand a chance. But of course, there is a lot of randomness and accidental character to when the big breakthroughs occur. And also, we know that the big breakthroughs often occur in fields of cross-traditional disciplines. I mean, if we think of biology in the last 50 years, a lot of the innovations were made by people who were trained in physics or in chemistry rather than in traditional biology. And now the link between computer science and brain science, for instance. So I think the most creative people are often those who span more than one traditional discipline. But I think we've got to ensure that they're educated and have the conditions when they can work. And of course, we're speaking Cambridge University, which has been the origin of many of the great ideas. I mean, I like to tell when I talk to financiers, they talk about the square mile in the City of London, how important it is. I said the ideas are generated in the square mile around where we are were far more important for the world than anything that's happened in the financial sector, going back to Newton. And so what we want to do is to foster ideas like that by providing the right creative environment, which requires expertise and the conditions allow it to flourish. And I think since we are both sort of academics at Cambridge University, that's one thing we've got to aspire to do here.
That sounds like a great conclusion. Martin Rees, thank you very much.
Thank you.